The duct tape made a sickening ripping sound as it pulled away from the dispenser. Theo's eyes went wide with terror, his 7-year-old hands instinctively reaching for his mouth as the silver strip stretched toward his face. His gentle humming, the soft, melodic sound that helped him navigate the overwhelming sensory chaos of the world, cut off abruptly as Karen pressed the tape across his lips with deliberate force. "There!" she snapped, her manicured fingers smoothing the edges with disturbing precision. "Maybe now the rest of us can enjoy this picnic without your weird noises ruining everything." The Willowbrook Community HOA annual picnic had been in full swing for barely an hour. Children's laughter mixed with the sizzle of hamburgers on the grill, the gentle splash of water from the community pool, and the distant hum of lawnmowers maintaining the pristine grounds. Theo had been sitting quietly on the grass near the playground, his back against the smooth bark of an oak tree, finding comfort in the repetitive motion of his fingers, tracing patterns in the dirt, while he hummed a simple tune his mother had taught him. The humming was his anchor, in a world that often felt too bright, too loud, too much. Those soft notes gave him peace. His occupational therapist had explained to his family that this self-soothing behavior was not just normal, but necessary for children on the autism spectrum. It helped regulate his nervous system, kept the overwhelming input of the world from spiraling into a meltdown. But Karen Morrison, newly elected president of the Willowbrook HOA board, saw it differently. She had been prowling the picnic grounds like a general inspecting troops, her clipboard clutched against her chest, her sharp eyes cataloging every perceived infraction of her unwritten rules of proper community behavior. The sound of Theo's gentle humming had grated against her nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Excuse me," she had said, her heels clicking against the sidewalk as she approached the boy. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Theo had looked up, his dark eyes confused and slightly unfocused as he tried to process the sudden interruption. His humming faltered for a moment before resuming, a little quieter now, as his anxiety began to spike. "I asked you a question," Karen continued, her voice rising. "Are you even listening to me? That noise you're making is completely inappropriate for a community gathering. Where are your parents?" The boy's humming grew slightly louder, not in defiance, but in desperate self-regulation, as the stress of the confrontation threatened to overwhelm him. His hands began to flap slightly at his sides, another coping mechanism that helped him process the flood of sensory information. "Stop that right now," Karen commanded, stepping closer. "I don't know what kind of attention-seeking behavior this is, but it ends here. You're disrupting everyone's enjoyment of this event." She looked around dramatically, as if the entire picnic had ground to a halt to observe the spectacle she was creating. In reality, most families were absorbed in their own conversations and activities, barely aware of the quiet boy under the tree. But in Karen's mind, his very existence was an affront to the pristine order she had worked so hard to establish in Willowbrook. "Ma'am," came a gentle voice from behind her. "Is there a problem here?" Karen spun around to find Margaret Chen, a longtime resident known for her kindness and volunteer work with special needs children. Margaret had been watching the interaction with growing concern, recognizing the signs of a child in distress. "The problem," Karen said icily, "is that this child is being disruptive and inappropriate. His parents obviously haven't taught him proper public behavior." "He's just humming," Margaret said softly, kneeling down to Theo's level. "Aren't you, sweetheart? It's a beautiful song." Theo's eyes met hers gratefully, and his humming resumed with slightly more confidence. But Karen's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Don't encourage him," she snapped. "This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that's ruining our community standards. Children need to learn discipline and respect for others." "He's not hurting anyone," Margaret replied, her voice remaining calm despite the rising tension. "He's just a little boy trying to—" "He's being a nuisance," Karen interrupted. "And if his parents can't control him, then I will." What happened next would haunt the witnesses for years to come. Karen marched back to the supply table, where the HOA volunteers had been setting up decorations, and returned with a roll of duct tape. The metallic screech of the tape being pulled from the roll seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the picnic, like a knife. "You want to make noise," she said, advancing on Theo with the tape stretched between her hands. "Let's see how much noise you can make now." Margaret stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Stop. You can't do that to a child." But Karen was beyond reason, driven by a toxic mixture of authority and frustration. She grabbed Theo's face with one hand, ignoring his muffled cries of protest, and pressed the tape across his mouth with the other. The adhesive stuck to his skin with cruel efficiency, sealing his lips and cutting off his ability to self-regulate through his humming. The effect was immediate and devastating. Theo's hands flew to his face, clawing at the tape as panic flooded his system. His breathing became rapid and shallow through his nose, his eyes wide with terror, as he realized he couldn't make the sounds that kept his world manageable. His body began to rock back and forth, a more intense, self-soothing behavior that kicked in when his primary coping mechanism was stripped away. "There," Karen said with satisfaction, brushing her hands together, as if she had just completed a perfectly reasonable task. "Maybe now he'll learn some manners." Margaret was already on her knees beside Theo, her hands hovering near his face as she tried to figure out how to remove the tape without causing more trauma. "Shh, sweetheart. It's okay. We're going to get this off you right now." But Karen wasn't finished. She turned to the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she announced, her voice carrying across the picnic area. "I won't tolerate disruptive behavior from anyone, regardless of age. This community has standards, and I intend to maintain them." Several parents had approached with their children, and Karen pointed directly at Theo, who was still struggling with the tape on his mouth, while Margaret tried to calm him. "Parents, keep your children away from this one. Clearly, he has behavioral problems that could be contagious." The cruelty of the statement hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. A few parents immediately began shepherding their children away, not because they believed Karen's words, but because they recognized the toxicity of the situation and wanted to protect their kids from witnessing more abuse. One mother, Sarah Williams, stepped forward with her young daughter in tow. "What you're doing is wrong," she said firmly. "That's just a little boy, and you're traumatizing him." "I'm maintaining order," Karen replied, her chin raised defiantly. "Something that seems to be in short supply around here lately." Sarah's daughter, Emma, was staring at Theo with tears in her eyes. She had played with him at previous community events and knew he was gentle and kind, even if he was different from other children. "Mommy, why did that mean lady hurt Theo?" she whispered. The innocence of the question seemed to snap something in several of the adult witnesses. This wasn't just an abstract discussion about community standards or appropriate behavior. This was a traumatized child being publicly humiliated and physically restrained by an adult in a position of authority. Margaret had managed to gently peel back one corner of the tape, working slowly to avoid tearing Theo's delicate skin. The boy's eyes were streaming with tears, his whole body trembling with the effort of trying to cope with the overwhelming sensory assault of panic, pain, and confusion. "Karen, stop this immediately," called out Robert Martinez, a longtime board member who had served with distinction before Karen's election. "This is completely inappropriate. Where are this child's parents?" "That's exactly what I'd like to know," Karen replied, What kind of parents let their child run wild at a community event? They're obviously neglecting their responsibilities. What none of them knew was that Theo's mother, Linda, was in the community center restroom, dealing with a sudden migraine that had been triggered by the stress of bringing her son to a crowded social event. She had left him in what she thought was a safe, quiet spot under the tree, knowing he had his coping strategies and that the community had always been welcoming to their family. Even more significantly, none of them knew that Theo's older sister, Deanna, was on her way to the picnic after finishing her morning court appearances. Deanna Rivera had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and had spent the last 5 years building a reputation as one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the state. She specialized in disability rights cases and had won several landmark settlements against institutions that discriminated against people with autism and other neurological differences. Margaret had finally succeeded in removing most of the tape from Theo's mouth, though red marks remained where the adhesive had pulled at his skin. The boy was still rocking and making soft, distressed sounds, but at least he could breathe properly again. She wrapped her arms around him protectively, shooting angry glances at Karen, who remained utterly unrepentant. "You had no right to do that," Margaret said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "No right at all." "I had every right," Karen shot back. "I'm the elected president of this HOA, and it's my job to maintain standards and order. If parents won't discipline their children, then someone has to step in." "Disciplining a child isn't the same as assaulting them," Robert said, his own voice rising. "What you just did could be considered battery." Karen laughed dismissively. "Battery? Don't be ridiculous. I simply put tape over his mouth to stop the disruption. Any reasonable person would have done the same thing." The crowd was growing larger now, as word of the incident spread across the picnic. Some people were filming with their phones, documenting the aftermath of what had just occurred. Karen seemed oblivious to the shift in the crowd's mood, interpreting their attention as validation of her authority rather than documentation of her abuse. "In fact," she continued, her voice growing louder and more strident, "I think this incident highlights exactly why we need stronger community guidelines about the kinds of families we welcome to our events. Clearly, some people just don't understand how to behave appropriately in public settings." The implications of her words weren't lost on anyone present. She wasn't just talking about Theo's behavior. She was suggesting that families with disabled children shouldn't be welcome at community events at all. Sarah Williams felt her stomach turn with disgust. "Are you seriously suggesting that children with disabilities shouldn't be allowed at community gatherings?" "I'm suggesting that all children should be required to meet basic behavioral standards," Karen replied smoothly. "If a child can't control themselves appropriately, then perhaps they need additional supervision, or perhaps they're not ready for public events." The coded language was clear to everyone present. Karen was advocating for the exclusion of neurodivergent children from community life, wrapping her discriminatory attitudes in the language of standards and appropriateness. It was at that moment that Linda emerged from the community center, her migraine somewhat improved, ready to collect her son and head home. What she saw made her blood freeze in her veins. Theo was huddled against Margaret Chen, his face streaked with tears and marked with red welts where tape had been forcibly applied and removed. A crowd of neighbors surrounded them, their faces a mixture of concern and anger. And standing in the center of it all was Karen Morrison, gesticulating wildly as she defended her actions to anyone who would listen. "Theo!" Linda cried, rushing forward and dropping to her knees beside her son. "Oh my God! What happened to you?" Margaret quickly explained the situation while Linda examined her son's face, her hands shaking as she touched the tender spots where the adhesive had irritated his skin. Theo buried his face against his mother's shoulder, his small body still trembling with residual trauma. "You did what?" Linda's voice was deadly quiet as she looked up at Karen. "You put tape over my son's mouth." "Your son was being disruptive," Karen replied, showing no remorse, even in the face of a mother's anguish. "I took appropriate action to maintain order at our community event." Linda rose slowly, her protective instincts flaring as she positioned herself between Karen and her son. He was humming. He was sitting quietly under a tree, humming to himself because that's how he self-regulates. And you physically assaulted him for it. "I did not assault anyone," Karen snapped. "I applied reasonable discipline to a disruptive child whose parents were nowhere to be found. If you had been supervising him properly, none of this would have been necessary." The victim blaming sent a wave of murmurs through the crowd. Even those who might have initially been sympathetic to Karen's desire for order were beginning to recognize the fundamental cruelty of her position. "So this is my fault." Linda's voice was rising now. Years of advocacy for her son combining with immediate maternal fury. "My 7-year-old son's autism is somehow my failure as a parent." "I didn't say anything about autism," Karen replied carefully, though her tone suggested she viewed it as an excuse rather than a legitimate neurological difference. "I simply said that all children need to learn appropriate public behavior." "He was exhibiting appropriate public behavior," Linda shot back. "Humming quietly to himself isn't disruptive. It's a completely normal coping mechanism for a child with sensory processing challenges." Karen's expression hardened. "Normal children don't need to make weird noises to function in public. If your son can't behave normally, then perhaps he shouldn't be at public events." The statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several parents in the crowd visibly recoiled, finally understanding the full scope of Karen's prejudice. This wasn't about maintaining community standards. This was about excluding anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable behavior. Linda was about to respond when a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Did I just hear you correctly?" The voice was calm, professional, and absolutely glacial in its controlled fury. "Did you just suggest that my brother doesn't belong in public spaces because he's autistic?" Every head turned toward the parking lot, where a young woman in a sharp business suit was walking toward them with purposeful strides. Diana Rivera looked every inch the successful attorney she was. From her perfectly styled hair, to her confident gait, to the legal briefcase she carried. But her eyes were fixed on her little brother, taking in his tear-streaked face and the red marks on his skin, with the keen observational skills that had made her one of the most successful civil rights lawyers in the state. "Diana!" Theo called out, breaking free from his mother's embrace to run toward his sister. She caught him in a fierce hug, her professional composure cracking slightly as she felt his small body still trembling from his ordeal. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, her voice soft and reassuring. "Big sister's here now." But when she looked up at Karen, her expression had hardened into something that would have been familiar to opposing counsel in a dozen high-stakes civil rights cases. This was Diana Rivera, in full advocacy mode. And Karen Morrison had just made the mistake of targeting her family. "You must be the person responsible for putting tape over my brother's mouth," Diana said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from years of courtroom experience. "I'm Diana Rivera, and I'm his sister. I'm also an attorney specializing in disability rights and civil rights violations." Karen's face went slightly pale, but her defiance remained intact. "I don't care what kind of lawyer you are. I'm the HOA president, and I have the right to maintain order at our community events." "Actually," Diana replied, pulling out her phone and starting a voice recording app, "you don't have the right to commit battery against a minor. Regardless of your position in the HOA, what you did to my brother constitutes assault and battery under state law, as well as a violation of his civil rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The crowd had grown even larger now, as residents throughout the picnic area became aware that something significant was happening. Diana's arrival had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation, transforming it from a community squabble into something that felt much more serious and consequential. Furthermore, Diana continued, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Your statements about children with disabilities not belonging at public events constitute discriminatory language that could support a harassment claim under federal disability rights law. Karen attempted to maintain her composure, but cracks were beginning to show. I never said anything about disabilities. I simply said that disruptive children need better supervision. You said, and I quote, "Normal children don't need to make weird noises to function in public." Diana recited with perfect accuracy. You also said that if my brother can't behave normally, he shouldn't be at public events. Both statements clearly indicate discrimination based on his autism spectrum disorder. Several people in the crowd nodded, confirming that they had heard Karen make exactly those statements. Diana made note of their faces, already building her case in her mind. You also physically restrained my brother by applying tape to his mouth, causing both physical discomfort and severe emotional distress. Diana continued. The evidence of physical contact is still visible on his face. She gently tilted Theo's chin up, showing the assembled crowd the red marks where the adhesive had irritated his skin. Several people gasped, and more phones came out to document the evidence. This is ridiculous, Karen blustered, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by some lawyer who's trying to make a federal case out of simple community discipline. Actually, Diana said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, that's exactly what this is going to become. A federal case. My brother's civil rights were violated in front of dozens of witnesses, and you've made it clear that your actions were motivated by discriminatory attitudes toward people with disabilities. She pulled out a business card and handed it to Karen with mock courtesy. Diana Rivera, Senior Partner, Rivera and Associates, Civil Rights Law. We specialize in disability discrimination cases, and we have a 97% success rate in federal court. Karen stared at the card as if it were a snake, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation she had created. But her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. Fine, she said, crossing her arms defensively. Sue me. I was well within my rights as HOA president to maintain order at our event. Actually, you weren't, came another voice from the crowd. Robert Martinez stepped forward, his face grim. The HOA board never granted you authority to physically discipline residents' children. In fact, our bylaws specifically prohibit board members from taking any action that could be construed as harassment or discrimination. Diana turned to Robert with interest. Are you a member of the HOA board? Robert Martinez, former president and current board member, he replied, extending his hand. I've been opposed to Ms. Morrison's increasingly authoritarian approach to community governance, but this is far beyond anything I could have imagined. Diana shook his hand professionally. Mr. Martinez, I'd like to request an emergency board meeting to address this incident and Ms. Morrison's fitness to continue serving as president. Absolutely, Robert replied immediately. I'll contact the other board members right now. We can convene within the hour if necessary. Karen's face was now genuinely pale. You can't just call an emergency meeting. There are procedures. Actually, we can. Robert interrupted. Article 7 of our bylaws allows for emergency meetings when a board member's conduct threatens the legal or financial interests of the association. Your actions today have exposed the HOA to significant civil rights liability. Diana nodded approvingly. That's exactly correct. The association could be held liable for the discriminatory actions of its officers, especially when those actions are taken in their official capacity during association events. The legal and financial implications were beginning to dawn on the crowd. This wasn't just about one cruel incident. It was about the potential consequences for the entire community association. Margaret Chen, who had been comforting Linda while the legal drama unfolded, stepped forward with something in her hand. Ms. Rivera, I think you should know that I recorded most of what happened on my phone. I started filming when I saw Ms. Morrison approaching your brother with the tape. Diana's eyes lit up. You have video evidence of the incident. The whole thing, Margaret confirmed, holding up her phone, including her statements about children with disabilities not belonging at public events. Karen made a sudden lunge toward Margaret's phone, as if she could somehow undo the documentation of her actions. But Diana smoothly intercepted her, positioning herself between Karen and the evidence. I wouldn't recommend attempting to interfere with evidence, Ms. Morrison, Diana said coolly. That would constitute obstruction, which is a separate criminal charge. The mention of criminal charges seemed to finally penetrate Karen's defenses. For the first time since the incident began, she looked genuinely frightened, rather than just angry. Criminal charges, she repeated weakly. Battery against a minor, assault, civil rights violations under federal law, and now, potentially, obstruction of evidence. Diana enumerated with professional detachment. Yes, there will almost certainly be criminal charges in addition to the civil lawsuit. Sarah Williams stepped forward, with her daughter Emma still holding her hand. Ms. Rivera, Emma and I both witnessed the whole thing. We'd be happy to provide statements, if it would help. Other parents began volunteering their testimony as well, creating an impromptu witness list right there on the picnic grounds. Karen looked around the crowd with growing horror as she realized how completely the situation had turned against her. This is insane, she said desperately. He's just one kid. Why is everyone making such a big deal out of this? The callousness of the statement seemed to seal her fate with anyone who might have still harbored sympathetic feelings. Diana's voice, when she responded, carried the full weight of her legal training and personal conviction. He's not just one kid, Ms. Morrison. He's a 7-year-old child with autism who was physically assaulted and publicly humiliated for engaging in completely normal self-regulation behavior. More importantly, he's a human being with the same rights to dignity and respect as anyone else in this community. She knelt down beside Theo, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus that characterized his way of processing information. Theo, do you understand what happened to you today? The boy nodded solemnly. The mean lady hurt me because I was humming, but humming helps me feel better. That's right, baby. And what she did was wrong. Very, very wrong. No one has the right to hurt you for being yourself. Theo looked up at his sister with complete trust. Are you going to make sure she can't hurt other kids like me? Diana felt her throat tighten with emotion, but her voice remained steady. Yes, Theo. Big sister is going to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again. She stood and faced Karen one final time. Ms. Morrison, you have approximately 10 minutes before I call the police to report the assault on my brother. I suggest you use that time to contact a criminal defense attorney, because you're going to need one. Karen's defiance finally crumbled completely. Wait, please. Can't we work this out somehow? I never meant for things to go this far. You meant every bit of it, Diana replied with quiet certainty. You meant to humiliate my brother for being different. You meant to physically silence him for engaging in behavior that helped him cope with an overwhelming environment. And you meant to send a message to our entire community that children with disabilities aren't welcome at public events. She pulled out her phone and began dialing. The only thing you didn't mean was to get caught by someone with the legal knowledge and resources to hold you accountable. As Diana spoke to the police dispatcher, reporting the assault on her brother, the crowd began to disperse. Some families approached Linda to offer support and express their outrage at what had happened. Others made sure to give their contact information to Diana for her legal case. Still, others sought out Robert Martinez to express their concerns about Karen's fitness to lead the HOA. Within 20 minutes, 2 police officers arrived to take statements and examine the evidence. Karen's attempt to minimize the incident fell flat when confronted with multiple eyewitness accounts, video evidence, and the physical marks still visible on Theo's face. The officers were professional, but clearly disturbed by what they learned. One of them, Officer Janet Morrison, no relation to Karen, had a nephew with autism and was particularly incensed by the discriminatory nature of the assault. "Ma'am," she said to Karen with barely contained anger, "I'm placing you under arrest for assault and battery on a minor. You have the right to remain silent." As Karen was being handcuffed and read her rights, the emergency HOA board meeting was convening in the community center. The 5-member board met in emergency session, with Robert Martinez presenting a motion to immediately remove Karen from her position and ban her from all future HOA events and activities. The motion passed unanimously, 4-0, with Karen obviously absent and unable to vote on her own removal. But Diana's work was just beginning. Over the following weeks, she filed a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit against both Karen Morrison individually and the Willowbrook HOA. The case alleged violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault and battery, and discrimination in public accommodations. The video evidence that Margaret Chen had captured became crucial to the case, showing not just the physical assault, but also Karen's discriminatory statements about children with disabilities. The footage went viral on social media, sparking a national conversation about disability rights and the treatment of neurodivergent children in community spaces. Karen's criminal trial proceeded in parallel with the civil case. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outrage, she eventually accepted a plea bargain that included jail time, community service specifically focused on disability awareness, and a substantial fine. She was also required to complete sensitivity training and issue a public apology to Theo and his family. The civil case resulted in a significant financial settlement that included damages for Theo's emotional distress, punitive damages against Karen personally, and a substantial award that Diana used to establish a foundation supporting inclusive community programming for children with disabilities. More importantly, the case resulted in sweeping policy changes throughout the community. The HOA adopted comprehensive anti-discrimination policies, implemented disability awareness training for all board members, and established clear guidelines protecting the rights of residents with disabilities to full participation in community life. Karen Morrison was required to sell her home and move out of Willowbrook as part of the settlement agreement. The new HOA leadership, headed by Robert Martinez as interim president, issued a formal apology to the Rivera family and invited them to participate in designing new inclusive programming for community events. The incident became a landmark case in disability rights law, cited in legal briefs and academic papers as an example of how individual acts of discrimination can be effectively challenged through comprehensive legal action. Diana was invited to speak at conferences across the country about disability advocacy and the importance of protecting vulnerable community members from discrimination. But perhaps the most important outcome was the change in Theo himself. With the support of his family and community, he gradually overcame the trauma of that terrible day. The settlement funds provided access to additional therapeutic support, and the newfound awareness in his community meant that he was welcomed and supported in ways that had never been possible before. A year later, the Willowbrook community held its annual picnic again. This time, it featured a special sensory-friendly area with quiet spaces for children who needed them, trained volunteers to support families with special needs, and clear policies protecting every resident's right to full participation in community life. Theo was there, sitting under the same oak tree where the incident had occurred. But this time, he wasn't alone. Several other children sat with him, some neurotypical and some neurodivergent, all of them humming together in a gentle chorus that filled the air with something beautiful rather than threatening. Diana watched from nearby, her heart full as she saw her little brother surrounded by acceptance and friendship. The legal victory had been satisfying, but this moment, seeing Theo confident and secure in his community, was the real triumph. Margaret Chen approached her with a smile. "You know, I think this might be the best community picnic we've ever had." Diana nodded, listening to the sound of children's laughter mixing with Theo's gentle humming. It's amazing what's possible when everyone belongs. As the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the oak tree, casting dappled shadows on the ground where Theo and his friends sat together, it was hard to believe that this same spot had been the scene of such cruelty just a year before. But perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all communities. Like people, have the capacity to learn, grow, and become better than they were before. The duct tape had been meant to silence one little boy's voice. Instead, it had amplified it beyond anything Karen Morrison could have imagined, carrying a message of acceptance and inclusion far beyond the boundaries of one small community. And in the end, that voice had proven far more powerful than all the authority and prejudice that had tried to silence it. Love had won, justice had prevailed, and Theo Rivera could hum freely, knowing that his community would never again mistake his differences for defiance, his needs for nuisance, or his humanity for something less than complete and worthy of protection.